Alright, hey guys, this is Thomas, and this is week 2 of our introduction to Python. So this week we're going to finish up some of the basics of the language, and then starting from next week we're going to move on to some interesting applications. Okay, so I have my text editor opened up here, and I already created a file called week2.py, and we're going to be typing most of our code inside of this file. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is, let's say we want to make our programs a little bit more dynamic. So one way we can do that is by getting input from the user. And we can get input from the user by using Python's built-in input function. Okay, so it looks like this. It's called input, and it takes in a single parameter, which is a string. And this is the text that we show the user when we ask them for input. So for our example, let's type in, what is your name? Okay. And this function will return whatever the user types in. And we can store that inside of a variable. So let's make a variable. I'm going to call it name, and in it we'll store the user input. Okay, so now if we save our file and then run it in our terminal, and I'm assuming you guys did the homework, so you know now how to run Python files on whatever operating system you're using. So if we run this, we see that we're prompted for our name. So if I type in Thomas, the program then ends. So the program just ends because all we're doing is asking for input and then we're putting it in a variable. But now we can do whatever we want with that user input. So for example, let's just print it back out to the user. All right, so if we run the program, type in our name, we see that it's printed back out to us. Okay, cool. So that's user input. We're going to come back to that in a second. But for now, let's introduce the next thing. Oh, and also, I don't think we talked about this yet. So in Python, if you begin a line with the pound symbol, that's called a comment. And Python will completely ignore comments. So these lines will not get run at all. This is useful if you want to annotate pieces of your code, or if you have some code that you're not using, you can just comment that out. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about. So in a lot of applications, you're likely to have code that you want to run under certain conditions, but you don't want this code to run every single time you run the program. Okay, so Python handles this with something called an if statement. Okay, so this is an example of an if statement. I'm just going to type it all out and then I'll explain it in detail. Okay, so this is an if statement. So you begin an if statement by using this keyword if, and then after that you put in some sort of condition which is either true or false. So in our example we have 5 greater than 2. So if 5 is greater than 2, then we run the body of the if statement, which is to print 5 is greater than 2. Okay, so let's run that and see what happens. So if we run it, we see that 5 is greater than 2 is printed out to us. Okay, so, but if instead we had the opposite condition, so if we had, if 5 is less than 2, and we were to run that, we see that it doesn't run. Okay, so that's an if statement. Clearly this example is kind of boring because we hard-coded the values inside of the condition, so it's predetermined whether the body will run or not. So let's do a more interesting example which involves variables. And we'll also make use of the input function that we just talked about. So let's make a little trivia program. So the first thing we'll do is ask for input from the user, and we'll ask a question. So for this example, we'll just ask, what is Thomas? All right, so if the user replies jobless, we'll tell them that they're correct. Okay, so let's run that and see what happens. So we see that we're prompted for input. And if we were to type in jobless, we see jobless is correct. However, if we typed in something that's incorrect, we don't see that message. Okay, so we got that working. Let's say that we also want to tell the user they're incorrect if they type in the wrong answer. And the way we would handle that is with an else statement. So after an if block, you can put in the word else. And then in the body of the else statement, you can put what you would like to run if the if condition fails. So here we're going to say you are incorrect. Okay, so let's run that. So we can see that jobless still works. However, if we type in something else, we're shown that we're incorrect. Okay, so that's an else statement. Now let's say that there's actually two answers to this question. So if the user types in jobless, then we tell them they're correct. However, if they type in the other correct answer, then we tell them that's correct as well. Otherwise, we'll tell them that they're incorrect. So the way we can add this functionality is using an else if statement in Python. So in between an if and else block, we can add something called elif, which lets us put in another condition if the if block fails. Okay, so if we say if answer is broke, then we'll say that that's correct as well. Okay, so what this is saying is if this user says jobless, we tell them that's correct. If they say broke, we tell them that's correct. Otherwise, we tell them it's incorrect. Okay, so let's run this program. We can see that jobless still works. And now broke also works. But otherwise, you're incorrect. Okay, so that's an else if statement. And you can have as many of these as you want in between the if and else blocks. Okay, so that's that. Let's move on to the next thing. So let's say we have a variable x and we assign it the value 4. So in this example, we have a variable which holds a single value. So in a lot of applications, however, you might want one variable to hold many values. And this would be the case if you have a lot of values, but you don't necessarily want to give unique names to all of them. You might just want to assign them all to the same variable. So to do that in Python, we would use something called lists. So in Python, a list is a collection of values. Right, and the way we would make a list is using this bracket notation. So inside of open and close brackets, we would put all the values that we want separated by commas. Okay, so this is a list in Python. And we see that we have 4 elements in it, the numbers 1, 4, 6, and 8. Okay, so now one thing we can do is print the list out. So if we run this program, we see the list is printed out to us, 1, 4, 6, and 8. So one of the things we can do with lists is we can access specific elements within the list. All right, so the way we would do that is using a notation like this. So we'd put the name of the list, and then right after it, we would put open and closing brackets. And inside of that, we put an index number. And this number is an index into our list. So here we're saying get the element at index 1 and assign it to y. All right, so now if we print out y and run it, we'll see that the number 4 is printed out. Okay. Also, if you're not familiar with other programming languages, in programming languages, we begin counting from 0. So that's why when we put index of 1 here, it actually gives us the second element. So if we wanted the first element, we would put a 0. All right, and that would return us 1. Okay. Cool. So there's a couple other things we can do with lists that are pretty cool. So for one, we can add elements onto the list. So to do that, we would put the name of the list. So in this example, X, we put a period and then we'd say append. And then in parentheses, we can put the value we want to add on. So let's add on the value 17 and then print that out. Okay. So we print that out, we see that our list now has the element 17 on it. Okay, and in Python, and this is different from other programming languages, in Python, the elements of your list do not all have to be of the same type. Okay, so notice that in our list, we have 4 numbers. What we can do is we can actually add strings on there as well. And this is not the case in other languages. Okay, so we can do print x, and we can see that that's perfectly fine. All right, so we see that the string hello has been appended onto our list. Okay, next thing. Okay, so you can overwrite values inside of a list as well. All right, so the way we would do that is we'd use the same syntax that we used above. We'd put the name of the list followed by brackets, and inside we put the element. But we put this on the left side of an equal sign. So now if we put on the left side of the equal sign, and on the right side we put the value that we want to reassign. So we can say x at index 1 is now the string 1. Okay, so let's do that and then print it out and then see what happens. Okay, so we can see that we've overridden the value 4 and instead put this string 1. Okay, now the one thing to be aware is to not go outside of the range of values you have. So our list X, we see that we have 4 values. We can't access element 100, for example. So if we were to do that and then try to print that out, we would see that our program actually crashes. So let's run that. Yep, and we see that we get an error. Okay, so just make sure that the number you use to access your list is lower than the number of elements that you have. Okay, so those are lists. Okay, so let's say we have a big list of strings and we want to print out every element of the list with an exclamation point on it. So for example, we would want to print out poo with an exclamation point, piglet with an exclamation point, etc., etc. Right, so how would we do this in Python? So in Python, we have these things called for loops. And if you're familiar with other programming languages, for loops in Python are a little bit different than they are in most other languages. Okay, so this is a for loop. I'll type it out and then I'll explain it. Okay, so this is a for loop. And the way we begin a for loop is by putting the word for followed by a name. So this could be whatever you want. In this example, I called it name, but it could be X, it could be Y. It doesn't matter. Okay, so then after that, we say in, and then we put the name of our list. So for us, that's called names. All right, and then you have a body of the for loop. Okay, so the way a for loop works is the body of the for loop will run once for every single element of your list. Okay, so it will run once for poo, piglet, tigger, etc., etc. And each time it runs, the current element of the list that is being focused on is given the name. Okay, so for every element of the list, we're going to print the current element, which we represent using the name, plus an exclamation point. Okay, so let's save this and run it and see what happens. Okay, so when we run it, we see that all the elements of our list have been printed with an exclamation point on it. Okay, so that's a for loop. While we're talking about loops, there's another kind of loop in Python called a while loop, and it's a bit more general than a for loop. So in a for loop, it's required that we have a list or these other things called tuples or dictionaries, which we will probably talk about later. But it's required that you have some sort of structure that you want to go through. A while loop does not require that. So this is an example of a while loop. So let's say we have a variable called x, and then we have a while loop. Okay, so this is a while loop, and the way it works is you put the word while, and then after that you put a condition. So our condition is x greater than 0. So while x is greater than 0, we run the loop. So the first time it runs, it checks if x is greater than 0, which it is because it's 5, and so it will print x, and then it will subtract 1 from x. So the next time it runs, it's 4. Okay, and it just keeps doing that until the condition is met. All right, so if we were to run this file now, we would see that we see the value of x at every iteration of the for loop, the while loop. Okay, so that's a while loop. It's used for just repeatedly executing code over and over again until some sort of condition is met. All right, so one thing to be aware of with while loops is to make sure that your exit condition will eventually be met. Okay, so for example, what if we had this while loop, but without x being decremented at every single iteration? So if we were to do that and run it, we would actually be stuck in an infinite loop. So this is printing out 5 constantly, and it will never end. So we want to make sure not to do that. Oh, also, to get out of the Python program if it's stuck, at least on Mac, do Control+C. I'm not sure about Windows, so if Control C doesn't work on Windows, I guess just exit the terminal and restart. But yeah, so you want to make sure you don't get stuck in an infinite loop by accident, because that's a big source of bugs. However, sometimes you intentionally want to be in a loop forever. For example, let's say you have like a web server, right? So web servers never turn off. They're constantly serving files to clients. So in that kind of situation, you would actually want the loop to run forever. And the idiomatic way of doing that is saying while true and then putting whatever you want in the body. So if you'll remember, for while loops, we say while and then we put some sort of condition which is either true or false. And if it's true, then it runs. So if we wanted it to run forever, what we would just put after the while is true, and it'll run infinitely. So we can verify that. Oh, oops. We need to set x to some sort of value. All right, and then we run forever. Okay, so that's a while loop.